Sign the agreement now. Now it's finalized.
The Mafia boss agreed to be her fake husband, but he had one condition. Valentina Russo was winding a music box with hands that would not stop shaking, and the tune came out wrong. Too slow, then too fast, then wrong again, because the mechanism inside had not been touched in 11 years, and neither really had she. Not since her grandmother's fingers last closed over hers to show her how. The box sat open on the kitchen table of the villa, its velvet lining worn pale in the shape of two rings that were no longer there, because the rings were now on the table too, gold gone soft and buttery with age, catching the last orange light off the canal outside. Beside them, an eviction notice. Official stamp still glossy. 30 days counted down to a date circled in red pen that wasn't hers. She did not cry. She had promised her grandmother's ghost she would not cry in this kitchen. Instead, she picked up the smaller ring, the one that had fit a hand 3 generations gone, and held it to the window light the way you'd check a diamond for a flaw, except she wasn't checking the ring. She was checking herself, turning over the only idea she had left, the one so foolish it might work precisely because no one would ever believe a woman like her would attempt it. Outside, a motorboat cut its engine at her private dock. Uninvited. Early. She did not know yet whose it was. She only knew that somewhere across this city, a man existed who could make 30 days disappear with one phone call, and that she was about to ask the most dangerous person in northern Italy to marry her. What would you do if the only way to keep your grandmother's home was to let a stranger call himself your husband? By 8 the next morning, Valentina Russo was standing in the ballroom of the Palazzo Contarini with 60 white peonies dying in the heat and a bride threatening to cancel a 400-guest wedding over a missing ice sculpture. She did not raise her voice. She never did. She crouched instead, heels and all, until she was eye level with the bride's panic, and she said, "Look at me. The swan will be here in 11 minutes. I have already called. What I need from you right now is not calm. I need you to trust me for 11 minutes." And then she stood, turned to her assistant, and rebuilt the timeline in her head the way other people rebuild a grocery list. Quickly, completely, without drama. This was Valentina's gift, the one Venice's oldest families paid absurd sums for. Not charm, though she had it, but the particular stillness of a woman who had never once let a room see her panic, even when panic was the only honest thing available to her. An event coordinator from a rival firm watched her cross the marble floor that morning, clipboard against her chest, and murmured to a colleague, not quietly enough, "She's good, for someone her size." Surprising, really. Valentina heard every word. She did not turn. She filed it, the way she filed everything, in a drawer she would open later, alone, and never in front of anyone who could use her hurt as leverage. She carried 3 things always: a measuring tape worn soft at the edges, a notebook with every client's fears written in the margins beside their flowers, and, since Tuesday, a folded eviction notice she had not shown a single soul. The villa had been her grandmother's answer to a war-torn childhood. 4 centuries of Russo weddings held in that same garden, and now it would belong to Riccardo Ferrante within the month, unless she did something no wedding planner had ever been trained to do. She walked home along the canal that afternoon instead of taking a water taxi, because she needed the 20 extra minutes, because the cold coming off the water reminded her she was still standing, still breathing, still capable of solving one more impossible problem before dinner. The stone bridges were slick under her heels. Somewhere behind her, a gondolier sang half a verse and abandoned it. She passed the villa's garden gate, ran her palm along the wrought iron the way she had since she was 6 years old, and felt, under her fingers, the particular texture of rust her grandmother had always meant to have repainted, and never did. So that evening, dressed not for a client but for herself, pale blue, pearls her grandmother had worn at her own wedding, Valentina walked into the one place in Venice she had spent her whole career avoiding, the private card room above the Ferrante-owned casino on the Grand Canal, where she had heard, through a bride's careless gossip, that the man who could save her would be playing cards until midnight. She pushed open a door she had no invitation to open. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with attention. 6 armed men reorganizing themselves around a door that had opened without permission. Valentina did not know yet which of the men at the table was the one everyone in this city crossed the street to avoid. She only knew that one man had not looked up from his cards, and that the not looking was its own kind of power, and that she was too tired and too frightened to be impressed by it. "I need 5 minutes," she said, to the room in general, "with whoever here can make a legal marriage disappear on paper in under 30 days. A guard stepped toward her. The man at the table. Gray eyes, a thin white scar interrupting one eyebrow, a suit that fit like it had been poured onto him, lifted 2 fingers, and the guard stopped as if she'd pulled an invisible leash. "You're in the wrong building," Alessandro De Luca said, still not looking at her, "for a business proposal." "I'm not proposing business," Valentina said. "I'm proposing marriage." That made him look up. He had been told his whole adult life, by men twice his size and half his intelligence, exactly what they thought he wanted to hear. He had built an empire on knowing, within a heartbeat, when someone was performing fear or performing confidence. What he was not prepared for was a woman standing in his card room in pearls, hands folded, not performing anything at all, simply exhausted and honest about it, in a way none of the men in this room had been honest with him in years. A small voice cut through the tension before he could answer. "Zio, is she the lady who does the flowers?" Julia had slipped in from the hallway in her pajamas, 8 years old and utterly unbothered by 6 armed men, and she had crossed the room and taken Valentina's hand before anyone could stop her, because Valentina had knelt, instantly, the way she knelt for panicking brides, and said, "I do flowers and cakes, and sometimes I fix weddings that are falling apart at the last minute." "What's your name?" Alessandro watched his niece hold a stranger's hand like she'd known her for years, and something in his chest, something he had spent 11 years keeping load-bearing and locked, creased, just slightly at the hinge. He did not explain, to Valentina or to himself, why he told his men to leave the room. What would you do if the most dangerous man in the room asked you to stay? He agreed the following morning in a voice that made it sound like a contract rather than a rescue. 30 days, a legal marriage, the villa protected under his name until the wills clause was satisfied. And then, before she could exhale, he added the condition. For 30 days, you won't pretend. In public or in private, you will be my wife in every way that honor demands. If we're going to fool the world, we do it completely. Valentina did not know, in that moment, that the words weren't about control at all. They were the only way Alessandro De Luca knew how to ask for something he wanted, without admitting he wanted it. The villa filled, over the following days, with small evidence of a life being quietly rearranged. His men learned her name without being told twice. Matteo, the eldest of the guards, began pulling out her chair before she reached the table. No announcement, no comment, simply there, the wood already scraping back by the time she arrived. Julia's bedroom, 3 doors down, acquired a nightlight shaped like a gondola because Valentina had mentioned once, in passing, that she'd been afraid of the dark until she was 10. Alessandro did something for her he had done for no one in 11 years. He asked what she needed. Not what she wanted. He distrusted wanting. But what she needed. And when she admitted, exhausted at midnight over the villa's account books, that she needed the wine cellar's water damage assessed before the wedding season began. He had an engineer there by 7 the next morning, and never mentioned it again. She did not know it was the first time he had offered help before being asked in longer than he could remember. She saw, in turn, the cost of his world. Late one night, she found him on the terrace, jacket off, staring at nothing. A single lit window in a house full of sleeping people. He didn't hear her approach. She didn't announce herself. She simply set down a blanket on the chair beside him and left. The silence between them louder than anything either of them might have said. The music box came with her, of course. She hadn't been able to leave it behind. She set it on the villa's piano, wound it each evening the way her grandmother had. And one night Alessandro found her asleep beside it, the melody running down to nothing, and he did not wake her. He covered her with the blanket she had once left for him, and he stood there longer than the moment required. He gave every guard at the villa a raise the week she arrived. He gave Giulia's tutor an assistant, so the lessons could run longer without exhausting her. He gave Valentina nothing but his attention, full, unhurried, the kind he had spent 11 years refusing to give anyone who might mistake it for weakness. She began to notice the shape of his days the way she noticed a bride's unspoken fears, the way he checked the villa's east wing twice each night before he could sleep, the way his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, whenever Giulia asked about her parents, the way he never once raised his voice in front of the child, even when his hands, afterward, were shaking with something he wouldn't name. She started leaving the kitchen light on for him, low and warm, so he wouldn't come home each night to a dark house the way he had for 11 years before her. Into this fragile architecture walked Riccardo Ferrante, warm, attentive, disarmingly helpful, offering Valentina his firm's legal team at no cost, given the circumstances, smiling at Giulia, complimenting the villa's restoration, giving no one in that house a single reason yet to distrust him. It was a small thing that told her first, the kind of small thing no one else in the room would have caught, because no one else in the room measured people's fears in a notebook for a living. Riccardo mentioned, over dinner, a detail about the villa's wine cellar he should not have known. A measurement, a specific one, the kind you'd only have if you'd already sent someone down there uninvited. Valentina's hands went still around her wine glass. She said nothing. She counted to 3, and when she looked up, Riccardo had already moved the conversation elsewhere, smooth as water finding a lower point. She told Alessandro that night. He listened, weighed it, and set it aside. Not because he doubted her, but because Ferrante had spent 3 days building goodwill that didn't match the pattern of a threat, and a man like Alessandro trusted patterns over instinct, even hers. "I'll have it looked into," he said, which she understood, correctly, to mean not tonight. She stayed anyway, not because she trusted his judgment over her own. She didn't, not fully, not that night, but because leaving would mean abandoning Giulia mid-story, halfway through a nightlight, and 100 small promises the child had already started collecting. She stayed for her own reasons, and told no one what they were. Alessandro, 3 nights later, made a choice that revealed more than he intended. He canceled a meeting with 2 rival families, a meeting 11 years in the arranging, because Valentina had mentioned, once, that she hated attending the villa's anniversary dinner alone. He sat across from her at that dinner instead, in a suit he hadn't needed to wear, and said nothing about what the cancellation had cost him. She didn't know the price. She only noticed that he'd stayed. It was Giulia who broke first. She came home from a supervised outing, white-faced and silent, refusing to say why, clutching Valentina's hand instead of her uncle's. And when Alessandro finally coaxed the story out of her, hours later, it was this. A man in a car had asked her, gently, sweetly, whether she liked her new auntie, and whether her auntie ever left the villa alone. Alessandro's face did not change. That was how Valentina knew, finally, how afraid he was. Valentina did not tell Alessandro what she suspected. She went, instead, to the one place she understood better than anyone in that house: paperwork. The villa's original deed, filed in her grandfather's careful hand, referenced a sub-basement beneath the wine cellar that had never appeared on any renovation survey since. She remembered Ricardo's dinner table slip, the measurement he shouldn't have known, and she went down alone, at dawn, with her grandmother's old lantern and a crowbar she didn't tell anyone she'd taken. Behind a false shelf, a decade of ledgers, initialed RF, documenting money moved through 3 continents and laundered, page by page, through companies bearing the Ferrante name. Evidence, she understood immediately, that whoever controlled this cellar controlled the fate of Europe's most powerful criminal network. This was never about her villa. It was about what her grandfather, decades ago, had unknowingly buried beneath it, and had written a will clever enough to keep sealed until someone married into protection strong enough to guard it. She photographed everything. She did not run to Alessandro first. She called her lawyer, secured copies in 3 separate locations, and only then did she go looking for him, not to be rescued, but to tell him what she'd found and what she intended to do about it. She found Ricardo first. He was waiting for her on the terrace, alone, and for one unguarded moment, before the practiced warmth slid back into place, she saw something that startled her more than any threat could have: genuine grief. "My father lost everything to men like the one you're marrying," he said quietly. "I was 12. I promised myself I'd never watch a Ferrante be powerless again." It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it recontextualized, instantly, every warm smile from Part 4, every offered favor, every compliment to Julia, as a decade-long performance of a wound that had never healed. Then the warmth vanished. "The evidence stays buried," he said, "or your happy little marriage becomes a funeral." Valentina did not wait for Alessandro. She called every guest on the guest list Ricardo himself had insisted on for the villa's upcoming charity gala. Journalists, magistrates, 2 of the rival families Alessandro had spent years avoiding provoking, and she moved the gala's date up by 6 hours, to that same evening, before Ricardo could react to what she'd found. She stood at the head of the ballroom in pale blue, pearls at her throat, 60 guests watching, and she did not shake. 14 years ago, she said, my grandfather buried something under his own wine cellar to protect it from men exactly like the one standing at the back of this room. She lifted the projector remote herself. The ledgers filled the wall behind her, page after page, in front of a room Ricardo could not afford to have as witnesses. That was when Alessandro arrived, not to save her, but to complete what she had already started, stepping into the frame beside her, as the room's attention split between the evidence on the wall and the 2 men now facing each other across it. He said nothing about vulnerability. He said nothing about love. He simply stood where everyone could see him choose her, in the one room in Venice where that choice would cost him everything and mean the most. "You knew," Ricardo said, backing toward the door, guests parting around him like water. "You knew this whole marriage was never about a will. I knew you'd underestimate her," Alessandro said. "Everyone always does. That's the last mistake you'll make in this city." Valentina stepped forward one final time, and the line she delivered was quiet, not shouted, the kind of quiet that made 60 people lean in. "You spent your whole life proving your family couldn't be made powerless again. Congratulations. Tonight, a wedding planner did it for you, in front of witnesses you invited yourself. Have you ever watched someone finally run out of places to hide? Ricardo's own allies, magistrates and journalists among them, people he'd cultivated for years, were already reaching for their phones. Matteo moved without needing an order. It was over before Alessandro had to lift a hand. In the chaos, the old music box, carried to the gala on a side table as part of the evening's decor, a detail no one but Valentina had thought twice about, was knocked from its stand in the scramble, its lid cracking open on the marble floor, both antique rings skittering loose across the tile in front of every witness in the room. 3 weeks later, the villa's wine cellar was empty of everything but wine. Valentina found Alessandro in the garden at dusk, kneeling in the dirt beside Giulia, both of them entirely focused on planting a lemon tree neither of them had any real skill for. He looked up when her shadow crossed the grass, and he did not say anything about the 30 days being over, or the marriage no longer being required by any will. He simply held out the smaller of the two rings, repaired now, the box's hinge fixed by a craftsman near the Rialto, and did not put it on her hand. He set it in her palm instead, and closed her fingers over it, the way you hand someone something that was always theirs. Giulia looked between them, with the particular seriousness of an 8-year-old deciding whether the adults in her life had finally gotten something right. "Are you actually married now?" she asked. "Or pretend married?" Neither of them answered her directly. Alessandro reached over and tucked a strand of dirt-streaked hair behind his niece's ear, and, for the first time since Valentina had known him, he smiled without checking first whether anyone was watching. That night, Valentina wound the music box on the same kitchen table where the story had begun. The melody came out right this time, unhurried, complete. The velvet lining still bore the ghost shape of two rings, except now both rings sat inside it, together, exactly where they belonged, catching the same orange canal light that had once fallen on an eviction notice, and now fell on nothing but two people who had stopped pretending weeks ago, and never said so out loud. Is there someone in your life who agreed to help you for one reason and stayed for a completely different one? Someone who saw you fully, the way the rest of the world never bothered to? Valentina never set out to fall in love. She set out to save a house full of memory, and along the way, a man who had spent 11 years refusing to need anyone quietly rebuilt his whole life around her instead. Tell me in the comments, what's the one thing you'd risk everything to protect? If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper.